Earlier, we looked at spinal nerves. Remember that there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they connect to the spinal cord. Each spinal nerve has a sensory component and a motor component. Now we're going to look at the cranial nerves. Cranial nerves are nerves that come directly off of the brain within the cranium, and we have 12 pairs of these nerves. Some of them are motor, some of them are sensory, and some are a mixture of both. The cranial nerves exit the cranium through foramina or through fissures, and just like the central nervous system, these nerves are covered by the meninges. So again, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they're numbered 1 through 12 using Roman numerals. Now, I'm always surprised every year how many students don't know how Roman numerals work. So if you're one of those students, make sure you take a little bit of time and learn this numbering system. We also always start at the front of the brain, so the anterior of the brain, and work towards the posterior. Pay attention to the names of the nerves because they tell you a little bit about either the function or the distribution of these nerves. Nerves consist of bundles of axons, and cranial nerves are no different. So a cranial nerve might contain axons that are collecting information and bringing it towards the brain, or perhaps those axons are sending motor information away from the brain, or maybe it's a mixture of the two. But this information is going to be generated or processed by little areas of the brain known as nuclei. This is a different use of the term than you're used to. I mean, usually when you think about a nucleus, we're talking about that area that contains the DNA within a cell. This is different. We're talking about a cluster of cells that have a shared goal. So it could be that we have bodies of neurons that are all sending out information, motor information, to the same muscle, for instance. Or it could be that we have a collection of neuronal bodies that are receiving similar information. And in this diagram here, you're seeing the nuclei that give rise to some of the cranial nerves or receive inputs from those cranial nerves. This diagram presents a really nice, clear overview of the cranial nerves, and we're going to go back and talk about each of these in detail. Note that we have 3 categories of cranial nerves with respect to function. We have some that are dedicated to special sensory inputs. We have others that are dedicated to motor outputs, and then we have some that are mixed. The mixed nerves are going to have some axons that are carrying sensory information towards the brain, and some axons that are carrying motor outputs away from the brain. Let's start by looking at the special sensory nerves. A special sense is a sense that requires a highly specialized organ. A nice example would be vision. Vision requires the eye, and the eye is a highly specialized structure. We have 4 special senses: vision, taste, hearing, and also smell. The first nerve, cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve, is responsible for smell. The optic nerve, nerve number 2, is dedicated to vision. Cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve, is dedicated to hearing. It also brings in information regarding equilibrium, so whether you're upright or upside down. We'll come back to those when we look at special senses and also general senses. Now there's one special sense missing, and that is taste. Those sensory inputs are carried by the facial nerve and also the Glossopharyngeal Nerve, and those are mixed nerves. Now it's important to note that for motor nerves, we also have a small sensory input occurring. So a motor nerve is going to contain mainly motor axons that are carrying information away from the brain, but there's a bit of information coming back. So for instance, cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor nerve, it's involved in moving the eye. It sends out signals to the muscles that move the eye. but there are some sensory axons that bring information back. This information is involved in proprioception. That's the perception of where your body and your body parts are in relation to each other and in relation to the three-dimensional physical world. So for instance, if you close your eyes, so you shut your eyelids, and you look towards the left, even though you can't see anything, you know that your eyeballs are pointing to the left. And that's from this sensory input that's coming back through these motor neurons. Now, just while I have this diagram up, I'll point out a couple more oddities. If you look at the accessory nerve, nerve number 11, you might note that it's coming off of the spinal cord. Historically, when people looked at this nerve, they identified it as a cranial nerve because this root up here, I'll just circle this, is quite obvious. And the root of this nerve, what you're seeing circled here, is within the cranium. But it has other connections that run along the spinal cord in the cervical region. So technically, it's no longer considered a cranial nerve, but historically it is. We're going to consider it as a cranial nerve for the purposes of this lecture. There's another cranial nerve that's not shown on here. It's one that's not very well known. There's a cranial nerve that comes off the brain up here, and it's referred to as the terminal nerve, or sometimes it's referred to as cranial nerve number 0. It doesn't seem to be especially important, and its function is poorly understood, but it may be involved in the sensation of pheromones, and it may be involved in sexual behaviors. So I just point this out so you know it's there. We're not going to talk about it in any more detail, but I invite you to do a bit of research on your own. It is actually quite a fascinating topic. What we're going to do now is look at each of the cranial nerves in a bit more detail. And we'll go through this fairly quickly. I don't expect you to know all of the information that's on these slides. There is some extra detail there. But I do expect you to be able to identify the nerves, if you saw them on a diagram, for instance, tell me the number of the nerve, and also tell me a little bit about what it does. So first of all, you should be able to tell me if it's special sensory, general sensory, motor, or mixed. If we're talking about a motor neuron, I would expect you to be able to tell me what sort of movement it brings about. So it moves the eye. It rotates the eye medially, for instance, or it allows you to move your head, or it's involved in swallowing, something like that. I don't expect you to remember the exact muscle that's being innervated. We'll start with the olfactory nerve because it is cranial nerve number 1. And incidentally, that's the way that you would write this in shorthand, CN and then the Roman numeral for the number. Spinal nerves are treated the same way. They would be SN and a number. So the olfactory nerve is nerve number 1. Olfaction means smell. It's a fancy word for smell. This is a special sensory nerve. What it does is it conducts information from olfactory receptors in the nose back to the brain. And that's all it does. Doesn't have a motor function, doesn't do anything else. It's just involved in smell. If this nerve is damaged, as you might expect, it's going to affect your sense of smell. All of the cranial nerves are paired. If both of these nerves were broken for some reason, you would have no sense of smell whatsoever. There's a swelling at the distal end of the olfactory nerve. This swelling is known as the olfactory bulb, and it sits right on top of the cribriform plate. If you remember, the cribriform plate is part of the ethmoid bone, and it has a lot of little holes in it, and those little holes allow axons from olfactory receptors to pass through. So within the mucosa of the upper part of the nasal passages, we have these olfactory receptors that will sense the shape of certain molecules. We'll talk about how that works when we get to the special senses. But these olfactory receptors will send information up to the olfactory bulb, and then that will convey that information onto the brain. Our next nerve, cranial nerve number 2, is the optic nerve. This is special sensory and only special sensory. This is something some students get confused about, but all this nerve does is receive sensory inputs from photoreceptive cells within the retina. It doesn't have any motor function whatsoever. It's not involved in moving the eye. There are 3 other nerves that we'll talk about that are involved in moving the eye, so they innervate muscles that move the eye. The optic nerve is not one of those nerves. Half of the fibers, half of the axons within the optic nerve cross over at a structure known as the optic chiasm. And this is a very obvious structure, so if you've had a chance to dissect a sheep brain, you will have been able to identify this. Now, as you might imagine, if this nerve is damaged, it's going to affect your vision. The retina is a tissue that's found at the back of the eyeball, and it contains sensory cells that respond to photons of light. Those sensory cells will send information back through the optic nerve to the brain. Now, note that these photoreceptive cells that are on the right half of the retina will send their information to the right side of the brain. That's the case for both of the eyeballs. Photoreceptive cells that are on the left side of the retina will send their information to the left side of the brain. And again, that's the case for both eyeballs. The information goes back to the occipital lobe. In comparison to other cranial nerves, the optic nerve is kind of special. It's actually part of the brain, whereas the other cranial nerves are formed on the periphery of the brain by neural crest cells. So remember that the brain and spinal cord form from the neural tube. We have this tube that simply expands to form the brain. And as it's expanding to form the brain, we have these little offshoots, or out pockets they're sometimes called, that give rise to the optic nerve and to the retina. So you can see in diagram A here, we have neuroepithelium. That's the neural tube. And the neural tube is going to stretch out and give rise to a hollow optic nerve and also the retina of the eye. And then later on, the surface ectoderm is going to fold in and it's going to give rise to the lens and the cornea. So the optic nerve is hollow, and it's hollow because it's part of the brain. Cranial nerve number 3 is the oculomotor nerve, and the name tells you what it does. So oculo means having to do with the eye, motor implies movement. The eye has 2 sets of muscles. We have muscles on the outside of the eye known as extraocular muscles. Extra means outside. Those are the muscles that attach to the outside of the eye and move the eye around, if you're looking around the room, for instance. Then we have the intraocular muscles, intra meaning inside. So within the eye, we have muscles that can dilate or constrict the pupil to change the amount of light that gets in. And we also have muscles that attach to the lens and can reshape the lens. They bring about focusing. So the oculomotor nerve is the only nerve that innervates the intraocular muscles. This is the nerve that's going to change the size of the pupil and also change the focus of your eye. It also is the major nerve when it comes to extraocular muscles. There are 3 nerves that innervate extraocular muscles, but this one innervates most of them. So if you're moving your eye around, this is an important nerve. If you wanted to test whether or not there was damage to this nerve, you could use a pen light. You could shine that into a person's eye and see if their pupils constrict appropriately. Or you could put a pen light or your finger in front of them and ask them to follow your finger without moving their head to see that they could move their eyeballs appropriately. Cranial nerve number 4 is the trochlear nerve. This small nerve only innervates a single muscle, the superior oblique. And that's all it does. This is one of the extraocular muscles of the eye. So it's going to be involved in movements of the eye. To test for damage, you might ask a patient to look down and medially. If they can't do that, this nerve might be damaged because that's what that muscle is responsible for. It's responsible for that one specific movement. The superior oblique muscle is a rather interesting muscle. It comes across the eye at an oblique angle, and the force is redirected by this little loop of connective tissue that's known as a trochlea. Trochlea is Latin for pulley. So we can see here that this muscle comes across, goes through that little loop, that little trochlea, and it's going to pull down like this. And that is going to rotate the eye and also direct the eye medially. I don't expect you to remember the name of this muscle, but this is just a little bit of background information so you can see where the name comes from. It's called the trochlear nerve because of that weird little structure here that acts as a pulley, and again, the Latin word for pulley is trochlea. Cranial nerve number 5 is a big nerve. It's known as the trigeminal nerve. The tri in trigeminal means 3 because this nerve has 3 major branches. The photograph shows the underside of the brain, and on the right of the photograph, the left of the brain, you can see an intact trigeminal nerve with 3 branches. The nerve on the other side is broken. This nerve does a lot of stuff. It has mixed function. So it has a motor function and also a general sensory function. Now we've talked about special sensory. Special sensory involves specialized sensory structures like the eye. General senses are the result of inputs from sensory structures that are distributed throughout a tissue. So for instance, within the skin, we have receptors for pain and temperature and pressure. So this nerve is going to receive inputs, general sensory inputs, from much of the face. But at the same time, it's sending out motor outputs to muscles of the tongue and also muscles that are involved in chewing or mastication. I'm not going to have you remember the names of the 3 branches, but just realize that this is a nerve that covers a lot of real estate. So it's receiving inputs from much of the face. And at the same time, it's sending motor outputs to the temporalis and the masseter, which are muscles that elevate the jaw and allow you to chew your food. And it's also sending motor outputs to the tongue. And the tongue allows you to form your food into a bolus, kind of a ball, that you can then swallow. The diagram on the lower left shows receptive fields for the 3 branches of the trigeminal nerve. A receptive field is an area that collects sensory information. Let's imagine that you have a patient, and this patient is numb on part of their face. What you could do is you could quite literally take a pin and poke them all over their face and map out the region of numbness. And you could check to see if this region matches one of these receptive fields. So perhaps their scalp and their nose and forehead is numb on the left side of their face. Well, that might mean that the left branch of the ophthalmic nerve is damaged. Our next nerve, cranial nerve number 6, is the Abducens nerve. And this is a nerve that innervates a single extraocular muscle of the eye, the lateral rectus. The name of this nerve comes from the motion it brings about. So to abduct something is to move it towards the midline. And this rotates your eye towards the midline. So let's say that you're looking at your nose. You're intentionally trying to become cross-eyed. You are using this abducens nerve to do that. We have now covered all of the nerves that are involved in movements of the eye. Both the trochlear nerve and the abducens nerve each innervate just one muscle. All the other muscles that move the eye are innervated by the oculomotor nerve. All of the muscles that are inside the eye that control focus and also control the size of the pupil are innervated by the ocular motor. And again, the optic nerve has nothing to do with any of this. The optic nerve is entirely special sensory. There are a number of disorders that can result if you have damage to one of these three nerves. It's most noticeable if it's just occurring on one side of the face. So remember that all of the cranial nerves are paired. We have one on the right and one on the left. So let's say that one eye is wandering. You have a lazy eye. Well, that could be due to damage to nerve number 3, 4, or 6 on one side of the face. Or maybe the nerve on that side of the face didn't develop correctly. The oculomotor nerve, as we've discussed, does a lot of things. It also controls the eyelids. If you have drooping of the eyelid, especially if it's just on one side of the face, that could be damage to the oculomotor nerve. If you have double vision, this could mean that your eyes are not focusing the same, or it could be due to the fact that your eyes are not pointing in the same direction. So this could be the result of damage to any three of those nerves, typically on one side of the face. Our next nerve is another big one. Cranial nerve number 7 is the facial nerve, and this is a mixed nerve. It carries general sensory information and special sensory, taste information, back towards the brain, and it also has motor outputs. It covers a large area of the face and the mouth and the throat. Damage to the facial nerve tends to be quite obvious, and that's because this is a nerve that innervates the muscles of the face that are involved in facial expression. The man in this photograph here has suffered from a stroke, and the stroke has damaged the facial nerve on the right side of his face, so the left side of the photograph. Now you might be thinking that side looks kind of normal, but this man is trying to smile. So he's smiling, he's contracting muscles on the left side of his face, but the right side of his face isn't responding at all. Our next nerve, cranial nerve number 8, is the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is a special sensory nerve. That's all it does. So it's involved in hearing, but also equilibrium. So equilibrium is your sense of balance. It's your sense of which way is up and which way is down. So the nuclei are found within the pons and the medulla of the brain. We have two branches to this nerve, one branch that's responsible for equilibrium, one branch that's responsible for hearing. In this diagram, you can see the inner ear. We have two highly specialized structures within the inner ear. The semicircular canals are responsible for equilibrium, and they are innervated by the vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Then we have this snail-shaped structure known as the cochlea that's responsible for hearing, and it's innervated by the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve number 9, has a mixed function. Glosso means tongue, pharyngeal means referring to the pharynx or throat. It does quite a lot of stuff. So we have general sensory inputs, touch, temperature, pain, within this region of the body. We have also chemoreception from the carotid artery. So there's receptors that are constantly sensing the chemistry of the blood. Of course, this is not something you're aware of. We have special sensory inputs, taste. So this is one of the nerves that deals with taste inputs. We have visceral motor outputs. Visceral motor outputs are motor outputs that you don't have any control over. This controls the salivary glands, and you can't control your salivation. But we also have somatic motor outputs as well. So there's a specific muscle within the throat, one of the many muscles that's involved in swallowing. The nuclei are found within the medulla. As mentioned, this has a visceral aspect and a motor somatic aspect. It's involved in the gag reflex as well, which is a reflex you don't have any control over. So if you stick your finger down your throat, you gag, you can't help yourself. This is the nerve that is involved in that response. And here we can see the root of that nerve. So again, it's innervating salivary glands, like the parotid gland. It's also innervating the tongue, and in this case, it's carrying sensory information from the taste buds back to the brain. And it's also collecting sensory information from the carotid bodies. The carotid bodies contain sensory receptors, and they're found within the carotid artery. The vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, is a very important nerve and also a very interesting nerve. It's the longest of the cranial nerves. It leaves the cranium, it goes all the way down to the chest, and continues on into the abdomen. It controls a lot of important functions that maintain homeostasis of your body. So it will control the resting heart rate, the resting breathing rate, and control activities of the digestive system. Vagare in Latin means wandering. Think of vagabond. A vagabond is someone that wanders around, and that's what this nerve does. It wanders through your body. The vagus nerve is an important component of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And we'll come back to that in more detail when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. But for now, just realize that it plays a very important role in maintaining basic homeostasis within the body. The nuclei for the vagus nerve are found within the medulla oblongata. Remember that that's a structure that regulates breathing and heart rate. And look where the fibers go. They go all over the place. We have connections to aortic bodies within the aorta. That's the large blood vessel leaving the heart. These aortic bodies sense changes in blood pressure. That information is brought back to the medulla. We also have information coming from the larynx. The vagus nerve is involved in choking reflexes. And then we have all these outputs. So we have outputs to the heart that can change the heart rate. They bring it back down to a resting state. We have branches that go to the lungs and control the breathing rate. We have branches that go to the digestive system and control the activities of the digestive system. Now, I should also mention that it does receive special sensory inputs from the tongue. It does play a role in taste, but it's a pretty minor role. It's not nearly as important when it comes to taste as the glossopharyngeal and the facial nerve. Cranial nerve number 11 is the spinal accessory nerve, and this is entirely somatic motor. It innervates the sternocleidomastoid, which is a muscle that will rotate and depress the head, and also the trapezius muscle, which is involved in motions of the head and shoulder. Now, this is the one I mentioned earlier that technically speaking is not a cranial nerve. Part of it does originate within the cranium, but most of it originates along the spinal cord in the cervical region. You can see here that it has several roots that come together and form the nerve, but most of those roots are outside of the skull. And one more diagram of that, you can see that one of the largest roots up here is just barely inside the skull. But most of the roots along here are actually outside of the skull. And finally, we have the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve number 12. This is a motor nerve, and it innervates muscles that you have control over, so it's somatic motor. It innervates muscles of the tongue and also muscles that attach to the hyoid. Remember, the hyoid is a bone that sits below the tongue in the throat. Many muscles attached to the hyoid. Those are muscles that are involved in moving the larynx, they're involved in swallowing, and they're involved in moving the tongue. Hypoglossal, hypo means below, glossal, the tongue. So this is innervating structures that are underneath the tongue. If you have problems with this nerve, you may have difficulty swallowing. You may also have difficulty speaking. Here we can see the innervation of this nerve. Remember, it is entirely motor. And we can also see the hyoid. The hyoid is this bone down here, and you can see there's a multitude of muscles that connect to it. There's a lot going on in this area of the throat. It takes a lot of small muscles, and it takes a lot of precise control to swallow and to talk. You can see the hyoid again right here, and you can notice that there are lots of muscles attached to it. And that's it for the cranial nerves. Once again, there's more detail in this PowerPoint than I expect you to know. Hopefully you found it interesting, but I do expect you to be able to identify the different nerves, know their names and their number, and know in general terms what they do.